Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Audrey Yu, and I'm the chair of the Inter-Asia Cultural Studies Society. On behalf of the Society, and together with our co-host, the Inter-Asia Cultural Studies Movements Journal and the National University of Singapore Cultural Research Center, I'd like to welcome all of you here today. We're very excited to start our first webinar for the Society. It is great to see so many of our IACS friends here today. Today's event is a book launch of Professor Tejaswini Niranjana's new book, Musicophilia in Mumbai. I think you can see the book here. Our book launch will be presented as an Inter-Asia online roundtable. We will begin with Professor Niranjana introducing key features of her book, followed by our panel of 5 distinguished speakers who will each say a few words about the book. And this will take about 40 minutes. After that, we will open up to Q&A for the next 40 minutes. So let me just say a few words about housekeeping. This webinar will last 1.5 hours. So we kindly request for you to mute yourself during the presentation. You will be unmuted during the Q&A session. There are two methods for Q&A. If you don't want to speak, please type your question in chat. If you want to ask a question, please type question in chat and we will invite you to speak. The chat function is open throughout the session. I'd like to inform everyone that we are recording this session. All videos and chats are included as part of the recording. Finally, please be respectful and kind to ensure a safe and conducive session for everyone. Thank you. Let me now introduce Professor Niranjana, also known to us as Teju. Teju is one of the leading figures in the Inter-Asia Cultural Studies movement. She's currently Professor of Cultural Studies at Lingnan University in Hong Kong. Her monographs include Citing Translation, History, Post-Structuralism, and the Colonial Context, University of California Press 1992, and Mobilizing India, Women, Music, and Migration Between India and Trinidad, Duke University Press in 2006. Today, we're excited to host the launch of her third monograph, Musicophilia in Mumbai, Performing Subjects and the Metropolitan Unconscious. And I've just received my copy of her book a few weeks ago, Duke 2020. So please join me to welcome Teju.
Strange to speak in silence from the other side. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever you are. I'm honored to be in this Inter-Asia discussion, the first of a long series, I'm sure. It's a strange time to be talking about publics and publicness, whether in Asia or elsewhere, now that the entire idea of the public, as it developed in modernity, is being utterly transformed. The idea of the public in my book involves the act of listening together, marked by the packed spaces filled with music lovers, the physicality of gestures of appreciation, the performer's satisfaction at seeing a packed concert hall, the silence of the audience as it is collectively moved on listening to a great performance. In my book, I tell a story about what came to be called Indian classical music, its practitioners and its listeners. It's a story of crisscrossing migrations and the formation of new urban spaces. At the center of the story is the musical subject, the musicophiliac, the person crazily in love with music. The very existence of this musical subject depends on their immersion in a social space, hence the social subject. But first, some words on the intriguing image before you. May I have the first image, please? Here's a colonial photograph. Someone is minding the waiting room, I hope. Yeah. Here's a colonial photograph. It's part of the larger circulation of images in colonial society. It's a picture taken in Bombay, processed in Luxembourg, circulating through the British Empire. On the right, you see a woman dressed like a Devadasi from Goa, from Western India. She's someone who would have migrated into Mumbai in the 19th century in order to learn Hindustani, North Indian music from the great Muslim teachers who had begun to migrate into Bombay. On the left, you see a courtesan, a tawaif, probably from the Mughal courts, who again had lost their livelihood due to the incursions of colonialism and with the dismantling of the courts had started looking elsewhere for patronage and ended up in cities like Bombay, where they actually provided a great deal of support to other musicians and became part of the hidden story of Hindustani music in Mumbai. Next slide, please. This is the cover of my book. This is a repurposed image by my friend Jugal Modi, where he's flipped the women in a sense to bring them, to situate them very much in the contemporary world. Both of these figures have become invisible in the story of Hindustani music in Mumbai. The Tawaif has completely become invisible, although the descendants of the Tawaif exist in dance bars, in mujra halls, in other kinds of invisible spaces in the city. The Devadasi became respectable, married upwards, lost the stigma of being someone from that background, and became an actress often in the Marathi and Hindi movies, and also some of them became very famous concert performers. Okay, and what I will do next is to just show you a few images of spaces. I will ask the host to show you the spaces to save time, and I will just say a few words about them. Let me speak over these. This would be the first image you saw was where the dance girls actually still live. And then you have the music clubs where mostly men, were the early listeners in the early 20th century. And then you have the inside of the music club, a very small room where you have the photographs of the great musicians of the 20th century who have all sung there for a small group of musicophiliacs. So these social subjects who inhabit these spaces, right? These social subjects who inhabit the great imperial city of Mumbai are bound together by the culture of collective listening. And they respond to Hindustani music through ways drawn from what I call the Metropolitan unconscious. The Metropolitan unconscious for me is a vast repertoire of collective, of forms of responding, or ways of living, of ways of inhabiting the city. It doesn't belong to any one person, so it's not an individual unconscious, but it's something that you can draw upon as a member of that larger collective of musical subjects. So I want to argue that this thinking through musicophilia in Mumbai will give us a sense, although it's very located, very specific to that city and the time, the colonial society and later, it gives us new material by which to think through questions of urbanity, of subjectivity and culture. And the relationship between cultural practice and the formation of the social subject can clearly speak to many other contexts, including all our contexts in Asia. So I do want to say that for me, what was very important in writing the book was, we can stop showing the slides now. What was very important in writing the book was to show how the past gets re-signified in the present, both in the present and for the present. My methodology in the book has been deeply informed by interdisciplinary engagement with a number of kinds of practitioners, especially, of course, with musical practice, but also with practitioners like filmmakers, architects, and designers. And this engagement, I think, makes visible the musical subject in a very different way than conventional academic research. It also makes visible the idea of the metropolitan unconscious that constitutes this musical subject, and even as it is constituted by these musical subjects. Yes. So to conclude, I'd like to reassert that notions of musical selfhood emerged in the long 20th century in Mumbai. But these ideas of selfhood were quite unlike the normative individual of Euro-American modernity. Importantly, the musical self is forged through collective experience and through social interaction in physical spaces. So all I can say is, here's wishing that we will once again have opportunities for such interaction. And in the meantime, I'm glad enough for this InterAsia Zoom platform. Thank you all so much for listening. And I'm really looking forward to have my friends and colleagues speak to the book.
Thanks, Taeju. Now I want to invite our first panel speaker, Professor Kim Soyoung. Soyoung is the director of the Trans-Asia Screen Institute, the president of the Association of Korean Cultural Studies, and professor at the Korean National University of Arts. She's a prolific filmmaker and author of many books on cinema, gender, and colonial modernity, including her forthcoming book, Korean Cinema in Global Context by Amsterdam University Press. So please join me to welcome Soyoung.
Thank you very much. I was disconnected from, the rest of you, so I missed a very precious introduction and Teju's speech. I'm sorry. Most of all, it is liberating for me to immerse myself in reading Musicophilia in Mumbai, when K-pop and BTS in particular surround me as dominant ambience in Seoul. So thank you. I'm sure this path-breaking book will help others find more musicophilia in non-West metropolis. The process of writing this book delineated by the author, Teju, is fascinating, creative, and exemplary. The book mobilizes the regimes of looking back historically and looking sideways by interviewing, observing, participating, learning, as well as practicing. Pradasana, a performance in a word, indeed. It urges me to rethink and elaborate one of my early essays published by Meaghan MORRIS, titled Cinemania and Cinephilia, Identity Question in the 1990s Seoul. Next slide, please. Also inspired by the docufilm, Returning to the First Beat by Sarabi Sharma, mentioned as a significant component in the research process of this book project, I'd like to lean back onto Inter-Asia method of comparative studies by placing my docufilm practice near her Pradashina performance. I worked on Exile Trilogy tracing the generations of Korean diaspora who first left the Korean peninsula in 1860s and settled in Russia and deported to Central Asia by Stalin. The second to Exile Trilogy, Sound of Nomad, next slide please, encountering Korea theater set up in Vladivostok of 1920s and proliferated even after the deportation to Central Asia in late 1930s. Next, please. They traveled and performed across the Soviet Union from the peripheral Turkmenistan to Moscow at the collective farms, as well as theaters in urban areas in 1970s and 80s. There was no Korea Republic of the Soviet Union, but only Korea theater. No territories, but theater and performers. I'd like to suggest that Musicophilia in Mumbai and Korea Theater in Almaty, Kazakhstan, compose historical and contemporary organization of fragments of non-Western modernity and the metropolitan unconscious. These theoretically and historically organized fragments of modernity urge me to redraw the plasticity and performativity of interiority. Next slide, please. Slide, next. And next one. Yes. The performativity of interiority and exteriority, troubling but compelling to repeat and rupture, in Teju's words, the complex correlation of subjectivity, collectivity, temporality, and place, even after the long 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you, Soyoung, for bringing in cinephilia and the Korean-Russian context to speak alongside musicophilia in Mumbai. Our second panel speaker is Associate Professor Chow Yu-Fai from Hong Kong Baptist University. Yufai is an award-winning lyrics and prose writer. His publications cover gender politics and creative practices, including Caring in a Time of Precarity, a study of single women doing creative work in Shanghai, Palgrave 2019, and Sonic Multiplicities, Hong Kong Pop, and the Global Circulation of Sound and Image, Intellect 2013. Please join me to welcome Yufai.
Thank you, Audrey. Dear Taeju, it's such a pleasure reading your book, or I should say it's such a variety of pleasures reading your book. I will start with something personal, or me as a musical subject to use the words. This is my attempt to imitate your book and my tribute. You should be here beside me when I scroll down the opening pages on my iPad. You should witness how I start smiling, nodding, eager to read on about what you're going to write on your Musicophilia, on how you premise your reflection and thinking on, well, not exactly the opposite of Musicophilia, but still quite an unlikely entry point, your premise on your not being able to learn music. On not being able to learn music, that's the title of your introductory chapter. I smile and I nod, not only as a colleague reading a solid, engaging intellectual work. My amusement also comes from my own biography as someone working in the music world for a long, long time. I have been writing lyrics for Chinese language pop music for more than 3 decades now. Reading your entry point, Taeju, I can't help recalling my own not being able to. In my case, as a Chinese lyric writer, it's the sharp awareness that I wasn't trained in Chinese literature or language at all. And I didn't, and I still don't read musical notes or play any musical instruments. I recall how I tried to learn guitar during my junior secondary school days, as all teenage boys do. You know, boys with guitars look incredibly cool, attractive, romantic, and all that. But after a couple of lessons, the teacher told me to quit. He said my fingers were too fat and too short. Later, when I became more experienced and confident as a lyric writer, I would often tell people, particularly young people, my not being able to learn Chinese and my not being able to learn music. My intention is to encourage them, perhaps to empower them, to tell them no need to be afraid and be stopped by a lack of credentials deemed necessary for pursuing a lyric writing career or a music career for that matter. Perhaps that's my politics of unlacking a lack, but it's a lack all the same. Taeju does something remarkable. In her work, I see Taeju transform her early experience of a lack, of a negative, of not being able to learn music into a productive trajectory, which brings her to archives, to ethnography, to interviews, ultimately to the book we are launching today. Taeju writes that her book will impact on a number of scholarly domains, ranging from cultural history and urban studies to psychosocial studies broadly defined, in her words. I venture to add one important domain of cultural studies, that of pedagogy. And I speak now as a teacher, as someone teaching lyric writing in particular, and as someone invested in music education in a broad sense. I'm yet to find the exact contours of how I'm using Taeju's Musicophilia inquiry as a pedagogical tool. But I'm quite sure in September, when I start teaching a new group of students interested in pop music and lyric writing, I will try to guide students to start their own Musicophilia inquiry. Maybe like what Taeju proposes, to take 2 kinds of moves, looking back to understand their histories and biographies, and looking sideways to learn from the experiences of others. Meaghan MORRIS once asked this question, which I always remember and which attracted me to cultural studies in the first place. She asked, what does cultural studies do? Taeju's book will do things for me and for my students. Teju has done other projects with me, including collaboration between Indian music makers and me. They created the tunes and performed, and I wrote the lyrics in Chinese. I have chosen some lines from a song by Bindu. I don't know if Bindu is here with us. If you are here, I want to thank you, Bindu, for writing the music, and that inspires me to write the following words. And I want to use some lines from the song to dedicate to Teju and to celebrate our passion for music and life itself. The song is called Poem to Be. Here are the final lines. Never explain the world. I don't recognize the heartbeats, but I hear the heart. Never possess eternity. Never possess eternity. Let me start again. It's not good. So let me start reciting the poem once again. Please allow me. Never explain the world. I don't recognize the heartbeats, but I hear the heart. Never possess eternity, but suddenly I sing. Never explain the world. I don't know the reality, but I am real. Never possess eternity, but I have listened to a poem to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Yufai. Thank you for sharing with us the poem, but also thank you so much for talking about the book. I guess from the sideways, I think that one of the key points I picked up from the book as well is the methodology of the sideways, and from your perspective and your talk, from that of a lyricist and a musical subject, as well as an academic. Our third speaker is Associate Professor of Practice Ip Kim Ho from Lingnan University in Hong Kong. His research on intercultural performance has been funded by the Free University Berlin, the Scottish Arts Council, and the Confucius Institute for Scotland at the University of Edinburgh. So please welcome Kim Ho.
Thank you. I hope that you can hear me well. So first, thanks for Professor Tejaswini Niranjana for inviting me to your book launch. And I am very happy when I'm reading your book, Musicophilia in Mumbai. It has constantly reminded me of my last year experience in India, particularly in Bangalore. I would also like to share with everyone about this very interesting project that Teju has led. In the past 3 years, I was invited to join with Professor Teju's this project and work with 3 Indian singers, Bindu and Rutuja, who is also mentioned in this book, and also Mr. Omkar. And I work with these 3 singers, and particularly with Mr. Omkar. I also got a chance to learn from him about Indian Hindustani music. So in other words, apart from being worked together as a musician, we also set up a kind of a teacher-student relationship. Now from that point, I would like to respond to one part of Teju's book concerning pedagogy and teacher-student relationship. To quote Teju's words, the teacher-student relationship can be reflected on 2 things. One is the collective memory of Hindustani music, and secondly, the relationships of musicians that makes traditional music become an important part of the urban Indian collective experiences. I think that from my experience working with Mr. Omkar, I constantly reflect on that experience last year when I'm reading this book, and feel that it's almost as if this sort of multifarious relationship from the past and the present is still tangible with this experience with Mr. Omkar. So for this section, I would like to read for you some extract from the interview with Mr. Omkar that probably reflect upon this teacher-student relationship. At the end of that collaboration, I interviewed Mr. Omkar, and that was done in 29th of June 2019 in Jayanagar area in Bangalore. And I asked Mr. Omkar, what do you think we can try to attempt and explore further in our collaborations? And he said that our collaboration will be a great inspiration for non-Indian students of music and musicians to learn about Indian classical music. And we are fully connected and really understand each other. Together, we can convey this message in the future collaborations. And many people are generally fascinated by Indian classical music all over the world. And if they see the way how we work together and we can convey that Indian classical music can be learned with a given preparation of the instrument we play and the teaching techniques I have to convey. Now, add to this point, because I'm working on the Indian Sun tour when I learned the Indian classical music with him. And so I use both voice and the playing techniques on the instrument. And Mr. Omkar basically teach me using the authentic way, just using his voice to teach me. So that is what he means. So both things, the given preparation of the instrument we play and teaching techniques together, Indian classical music can be performed on a very high level. And some other people don't know how to approach a teacher or how they can learn Indian classical music. And the second point I would like to share here is I asked Mr. Omkar, so what is the essential thing you want to teach people who want to know more about Indian classical music tradition? And Mr. Omkar replies in his work, in the Indian classical music tradition, we are trained to be creative. What is the methodology of being creative? And he said, in Western music, there are three aspects of performance. One is the composer, the second, conductor, and the third, performer. But in Indian classical music, you are all three into one. You are your own composer because you compose your own songs, and your own conductor because you want to know in what direction the song has to go. And you are performing yourself. And when this happens, musicians have more freedom and creativity. This is what Indian classical music gives us. Everywhere I want musicians to enjoy absolute creative freedom, which Indian classical music has given me. That's what I want to convey. Now, this is a quotation from Mr. Omkar, who has joined this project. Teju has led us together in Bangalore last year. I wish that this sharing will lead you to also reflect upon the aspect of pedagogy and teacher-student relationship that has been mentioned in Teju's book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim Ho, for sharing with us your kind of practice-based research perspective on the one hand, and also sharing your experiences of the musical collaboration between musicians in Hong Kong and Mumbai and the cross-cultural exchange. I've seen some of the footage to that and how those moments of exchange have led to new forms of pedagogy. And finally, also thank you for drawing out the book's notion of musical creativity as a new way of thinking about creativity. Our next speaker is Dr. Chih-ming Wang, also known as Andy. Andy is Associate Research Fellow at Academia Sinica in Taipei. He is the author of Trans-Pacific Articulations, Student Migration and the Remaking of Asian America, University of Hawaii Press, 2013, and the co-editor of Precarious Belongings, Effect and Nationalism in Asia, Raman and Littlefield, 2017. Please welcome Andy.
Hello, thank you, Audrey. I hope you can all hear me fine. It's a great pleasure to be part of this panel. Of all the speakers, I'm probably least qualified to speak on Teju's book, which is very interesting on music, but I'm not really an expert on that. But in any case, I would like to speak from a from a position of an interested outsider. And so let me just begin by congratulating Teju on writing a very enviable book. It's a book about love, of love, one that tells stories of how love for music is passed down and on. This is important in my view because we're living in an age of rage and anxiety that thrives on a large memory capacity, but with only a tiny bit of history. So Teju brings back history through memory. She tells both the story of how she finds the history of musical
Okay, Andy has stalled and he has he'll come back in again. So maybe in the interest of time, maybe we can move on to Meaghan first, and then when Andy comes back on, he can join the panel after Meaghan. So it's my pleasure to welcome Meaghan MORRIS. Meaghan doesn't need any introduction to all of us here in culture studies. She's one of the leading theorists in culture studies. She's professor of gender and culture studies at the University of Sydney and the former chair professor of culture studies at Lingnan University in Hong Kong. Her research is on martial arts cinema, and her most recent book was Creativity and Academic Activism, Instituting Culture Studies, co-edited with Matt Hurt from Duke University Press in 2012. So please join me to welcome Meaghan.
Thank you, Audrey, and hello to everybody. I think I can see Andy there, but I'd like to begin by being frank and extending a little bit what he was saying, which is to say that in spite of my deep respect over many years for Teju's critical imagination, I didn't expect to enjoy reading Musicophilia in Mumbai. I'm just not much into music, generally. I'm embarrassed to say that in this company, and I can have a wonderful musical experience, as I did a couple of times hearing Teju herself sing and attending a Sat performance in Hong Kong with the Indian musicians and Chow Yu-Fai. But somehow this does not move me ever to repeat the experience on my own. That's what I mean by not being into music. I certainly know nothing about Hindustani classical music and very little about Mumbai, so I thought it might be hard labor to read about the evolution of classical musical publics in that city. Now, I mention this not to be coy, but because I think this dull in advance approach to the act of reading is a very common aspect of academic life and experience now. It's why so many of us have hundreds of PDFs that we will never read. There used to be hundreds of photocopies. So it's absolutely to salute the achievement of this book that I want to confess most sincerely that I found it exhilarating to read from the very first page. It's a profoundly original and knowledge reshaping project. Of course, the text is beautifully composed, as we might expect from a scholar who is herself a creative writer and an award-winning translator. But beyond this, Teju's achievement in this rich account of how the migration of linguistically as well as culturally diverse communities to Mumbai in the second half of the 19th century shaped a new kind of modern public for classical music performance, how that pushes the boundaries of Anglophone cultural studies generally, as well as enlarging the Inter-Asia project in significant ways. First, I think it takes the preoccupation in cultural studies globally with migratory and diasporic cultures into the study of the collective life internal to a major non-Western metropolis. This is a shift of emphasis that may seem slight, or more likely it's one that many scholars called for in theory in those endless PDFs that we accumulate that don't often lead to substantial knowledge projects. I've never before seen this achieved with so much rich detail that the resulting narrative of urban public formation is as memorable and persuasive as an engrossing national or regional history. The second achievement, a methodological one, is responsible for this, I think. That's her fusion of detailed local historical research with urban space analysis on the one hand, and we caught a glimpse of that in the slides, and interview-based fieldwork on the other, and we also saw that in the slides, and these approaches come together in a flawlessly inventive way because the work is so deeply grounded. Third, there's the force of Teju's insistence on determining from really thick empirical evidence what public culture might mean in a specific non-Western context of modernity. Her decision to first establish what the categories folk, film music and classical music have meant historically in the Mumbai context is consequential. So is her pursuit of the conceptually difficult path of studying musical practices rather than rehearsing critiques of institutions and ideologies. The critiques clear a path, don't mistake me, but at some point we have to go on to produce new histories, and that is really challenging for everybody in today's conditions of academic labour. It's a miracle to be able to actually do it. It's much easier, and it's nobody's fault to write an article about why it ought to be done. So these three features, the focus on complex collective life, a fusion of historical research with space analysis and fieldwork, and the genesis of a model of the public from grounded empirical evidence, all combine to generate what is for me a theoretically resonant study of that enigmatic phenomenon, collective subjectivity formed through shared passion, in this instance, love of music. We learn how urban spaces on the one hand and inherited cultures of learning on the other are both transformed by and help to shape the sociality of that collective subjectivity and its unfolding as an unconscious that is beautifully described as a, quote, sedimented repertoire of ways of living and experiencing. So my hope is that Musicophilia in Mumbai may be read for its innovative methodological and theoretical force, as I think others have actually already suggested. The French critic Roland Barthes once defined theory as an outcome of the text. And by text, he meant the practices of reading and writing. This is the opposite of an approach that still bedevils us greatly, that asks how we can apply a given theory. In both approaches, theory can be seen as inspiring, But theory is an outcome, is an inspiring creative process of production, not application. We make theory. And as this book shows us, this production of inspiration is one of the most effective ways of internationalizing the practice of cultural studies without sacrificing its local embeddedness in cultural life. And in spite of my musical philistinism, it has certainly inspired me. So thank you, Teju, for writing this.
Thank you, Meaghan, for so eloquently highlighting 3 to 4 key aspects of Teju's book, in particular, the history of migration as part of the collective metropolitan public urban life, and new ways of new methods, if you like, captured in the book, historical archive, practice, as well as sort of our previous speakers have talked about interviews and so on and so forth. And finally, all that to come together to draw up a new kind of public culture, and through that, a new way of theorizing the metropolitan unconscious and a non-Western modernity. So with that, can I just bring Andy back to the discussion, because he was disconnected and he was midway through his discussion. So Andy, are you in the room?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so I'll pass it back to Andy. Go for it.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry for being disconnected just now. Since I already maybe wasted 2 minutes on that, so I'll just get right into the point. I think the book is really enviable, as I said earlier, because it's very inspiring. It is a book that I would never get to write, but it is very inspiring in the sense that it really challenges me to think about what music is. The Hindu classical music is certainly not a kind of music I'm familiar with, let alone used to. And the way Teju described how this music has been conveyed and practiced and learned and transmitted, both online and offline, has really created a different universe for me to think about how much of my understanding of music has been very much codified by the Western form and the contemporary form. And for that, I want to thank Teju for opening up a new window for me to think about what music is. As she said, as she told me in the email exchange, that it's primarily about singing, and that singing is really critical as opposed to instrumental music, which is precisely not what I have thought about Indian music to begin with. And in that sense, it also encourages me to kind of think about the national music in Taiwan and Chinese context, where this quote-unquote classic is both an invented tradition, but also something that does go beyond the contemporary and modern period. And the question then for us is that how do we get reconnected to that past? How do we reconnect it to these other ways of listening and learning about music? The other thing I really want to emphasize is that the book really brings up to me how to think about pedagogy in both traditional and contemporary ways, particularly the way Teju has described about how the earlier gurus have passed down the music and how difficult it is for the learners to figure out exactly how to hit the pitch or hit the right tune or tone. In that sense, it also shows me that learning as a form of education, or particularly this kind of learning music as a form of education, is also a generational thing. The earlier generation may be okay simply learning with the master by sticking to what the master says, but in a contemporary moment, especially in the pandemic moment where everything is online, it's an experience that cannot be repeated. In that sense, the ways of teaching and the means of teaching becomes, if not contradictory, but two different modes of pedagogy that we need to navigate. And that also brings me to thinking about the IACS project in a contemporary setting, where we are no longer able to meet in person, but the memory of the past experience of working together, being in a closed space, still remains very important to me as far as my education goes. So in that sense, I would like to say, even though the idea of cross-regional consolidated program that we once envisioned IACS to take form may not have overcome the institutional constraints of modern higher education, its spirit of communal learning and interreferential scholarship indeed occupied a certain spaces of being, whether it is in the classrooms of NUS, the open space gym at Silliman University, Philippines last year, the serene campus of Songkong University, or on the marble floor of the Victoria Memorial Hall in Kolkata in this hot summer day. I think these are the spaces in which certain memories of IACS has been inscribed, at least in my mind. And I feel very lucky to be among those few to be working in close range with the masters and gurus to learn, to connect, and to perform scholarship that can lead to the future. In this sense, Taeju's book is an apt metaphor, reminding us to treasure the tradition of communal scholarship and pass it on. So I want to take this moment again to thank everyone for organizing this event, and especially to Taeju for writing this book and having me on board with this panel. It's great to see everybody's face, or at least to see people in the same room, quote unquote, in this time of separation and isolation. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy, for reminding us of the, the book's, kind of many different ways of listening and talking about music. Also in the context of pedagogy, learning music as a form of education. And like you too, I've also missed our get together in the Inter-Asia spaces, and through those events have also learned from masters and guru as well. In Taeju's book, there's a last chapter called Nearness as Distance and Distance as Nearness. And she talks about the intimacy that can be forged through, in her context, learning from her teacher through Skype. And I think today in the context of our Zoom platform, I also hope that our event can hope to foster a sense of collective intimacy as a way to move forward the conversation of Inter-Asia. So with that, then I want to congratulate Taeju on the book and invite her to say a few words to respond to the panel before we open up to Q&A.
Thank you, Audrey. Hello, can everyone hear me? So I think Audrey's image is frozen on the screen. So if the host can change it back to my image. Yeah. So thank you so much. And it's lovely to have friends speak to the book and tell me how much they liked it. I was actually a little surprised. I wanted very much for all of them to like it, especially these people that I had in mind to be respondents. But I wasn't sure on what plane they would respond to it. Was it only out of friendship and affection, or was it because it was an academic chore, or because it actually spoke to something that they themselves were thinking about? I had no way of guessing. And I think I'm really gratified to find that the book, in spite of its very detailed local embedding in the city of Mumbai, has actually been able to connect to so many questions that people are asking, especially in these perilous times. I'm really delighted to have Soyoung, old friend, old collaborator, having her respond especially to the question of interreferencing that we have been all talking about in IACS, and in particular, Chen Guanxing and Jia Benghuat are, our seniors in the project. So interreferencing by talking about Soyoung's own work as a filmmaker and a theorist of the cinema, the whole amazing work on the Korean diaspora, if you may call it, in Central Asia, that's been astonishing. And to merge that in her response, she tries to bring that together with the larger question of cinemania or cinephilia that obsesses all of us, whether we are into music or not. We are certainly all in the modern world cinephiliacs. So I think I really appreciated that, Soyoung. Thank you so much for also touching upon the question of interiority, exteriority. What does it mean to inhabit a space that you're trying to be critical about, but still loving at the same time? I think you brought that out very well also, and I'm glad that that part of the book appealed to you. Thank you again. Yufai, thank you for reading alongside me. I'm so unhappy that when we met and I gave you the book and I have not seen you again since that time, but I'm glad that we are reading together no matter where we are. And I like the way that you sort of entered the book and as though you were sitting next to me and we were having that coffee that we did in that time. I think that you drew attention, as did a couple of others, to the methodology of looking back historically and looking sideways to look at the contemporary, that I was very keen on foregrounding in the book. So thank you for picking up on that and also saying that it will be of some use to you in your own thinking and teaching practice. I especially cherish the fact that Yufai has been a lyrical collaborator and has really, I was hoping you'd read that poem in Cantonese, Yufai, but he read it in English, which he also speaks very, very elegantly. But I will ask him to send it to me in both Cantonese and English. And then maybe we sing it. If Bindu and others are there in the audience, we will at some point sing this in Cantonese, but in Hindustani style, as our collaboration has always been. Thank you, Yufai, also for bringing up the aspect of pedagogy that Kim Ho has also done. And I can see that maybe we're all teachers, and maybe that's why the pedagogy thing jumps up at us as so central, and maybe that's why I obsessed about it so much. But I also talked about it at great length because of my own struggles as an amateur practitioner trying to learn the music in modern times without access to the old modes of teaching or just being inserted into something at a later stage in life and not knowing how to grow into a practice, but having to learn it, right? So I think this concern with pedagogy has been with me very much from the beginning of my engagement with music, which is more than 15 years now. And it's no surprise that it's playing such a big role in the book. And it's interesting and probably not so remarkable, actually, that Yufai, Kim Ho, and Andy also brought up this question of pedagogy, as they read it as very central, the teacher-student relationship. How do you think about teaching, and what does it involve to teach in these challenging times? I think this is what Yufai was also saying. So thank you for bringing that to the fore. Thank you, Andy, for also referencing our memory of working together. I hope that it will not only be a memory, but be a reactivated memory that we can go back to as we move on to new spaces. So someday, at least in your lifetime, if not in mine, this will happen. And you will, I think, be creating new spaces for IACS, for which I, congratulate you in advance. Meaghan, old friend, colleague, collaborator, thank you so much, especially for talking about migration. I think it is so central to the book. It doesn't feature anywhere in the title, but without that thinking through the question of migration and what it means when you're trying to dislodge an idea of something that is essentialized or solidified or seems to belong, naturally or indigenously in some place, and you're trying to show how that was composed, I think you have to bring up the question of migration. So many of our, troubles in the present day world have to do with trying to decide who is inside and who is outside. And I think that to show that all these forms of migration bring about a collective experience in our present is a very important, I think, aspect that you brought to the fore. So thank you for that. And again, to say that I'd like to end on this note, thanks to Meaghan again for reinforcing the idea of the public that I was trying to really get at in the book, and had to do through this question of the performance of modernity by this musical subject. But my major preoccupation was really, what kind of public are we talking about? It's not the public sphere in the Habermasian sense. It's a very different kind of public, and maybe there are other publics in Asia similarly configured, which draw on the love of something, which is not a rational love, which is something excessive. So it's the excessive subject of musicophilia, in my instance, is really the subject of the non-Western public. That's what I was trying to get across. Thank you again for bringing that up. So once again, thank you all. I was so delighted that all of you could be with us today. And thanks to Audrey for chairing. I hope there are lots of questions now. I encourage audience members to ask questions of individual speakers or of myself. I know that many of you came in well into the session, so you may not have heard what I said, but please feel free to respond to anyone that caught your attention.
Okay, thanks, Taeju. I'm just trying to rally our crowd here. It's Q&A time. So please type your questions in chat, or please, if you want to speak, just type question if you want to speak. And I want to introduce my colleague, Dr. Anissa Bita from the University of Melbourne, who will actually read out the questions. So we're still waiting for the questions to form on chat. So maybe whilst we wait for people to start, if I can ask Taeju a question really around the research. How long did it take for you to do the research for the book? It seems, you know, a big project and a deep project. And there are many other arms, including exhibitions and films as well. So if you want to tell us a little bit more about the research and the writing process and, you know, the kind of time that you take to do all that.
Yeah, well, all of us who've tried to write books or even tried to write a paper know very well that there's no start point and end point to any of this, right? It's very serendipitous how you end up in a particular space. The reason I started working on this, there is no one reason. It really goes back a long way, and my fascination for this kind of music. And then I actually ended up living part of the time in Mumbai, and it seemed to make a lot of sense then to work on that. People are still coming in, so I don't know what they're responding to. Anyway, just to backtrack a little bit. Sorry, someone minding the waiting room? I don't want to be doing this in the middle of my talking. Yeah.
Yes, we are.
Okay. So just to backtrack, I was actually originally working on North Indian classical music in my own state in the south, in Karnataka. And that's a whole complex set of questions around language, around nationalism that I tried to explore. For various reasons, I couldn't continue with that work. I had earlier in the early 2000s worked with the filmmaker Surabhi Sharma on making a film on the musical culture of the Caribbean. We took a pop singer from India, and we had an amazing time for a month working in the Caribbean. And the film Jahaji Music, India and the Caribbean, changed my writing, because after I did field work with the film crew, especially a film crew from India, when everyone's eyes saying Bollywood, Bollywood, whatever, I gathered so much material for my research that I hadn't been able to do in 10 years of visiting the Caribbean. So I had to actually rewrite the book. And I think it made for a more interesting book because I was able to infuse it with many different voices that came from the filmmaking and collaborative music process. This really brought me to a concern with musical practice, because I was working in the studios with these Caribbean musicians, and it gave me a very different insight into this process of making music and how it might actually impact the way we think about some of these research questions. So when I thought in 2011, I was thinking, well, maybe I should really work on music in Bombay. I was already studying music, learning music in Bombay at the time. I approached my friend Surabhi and I said, you really messed up my project last time because we did the film last. This time we will begin with the film. We will do the research and the film together. And one will reflect the other and one will impact the other in hopefully significant ways. So I think this is an important part of the methodology. It's not simply an academic project where I say, I will work on this, here's my archive, here are my texts, and I will then write about it. But and it's not only a conventional ethnography, it certainly isn't. But it has a lot to do with how one engages with practitioners of various kinds. My architect friends helped me to discover different features of Mumbai's native town, and without them, I think this book would have been the poorer. The filmmaking process began from day one. We got a small grant to be able to start the filming. We found the subjects together. Sometimes it was Surabhi, sometimes it was me. We asked the questions together. Sometimes, we shared the responsibility. There were some interviews I did, there were some interviews that she did. We finally had no money to continue with the filming, so we just ended up using a small video camera, because I think a visual record is important. We have a huge database of this on pad.ma, which is a major archive, a free, freely available archive in India. If you look for pad.ma under Mumbai Music, you will find all the research interviews that we conducted. These have not made their way into the film. The film was really about exploring the spaces of Mumbai. Interestingly, the film was premiered at the Mumbai International Film Festival in the same month that I sent off my final manuscript to Duke and to Tulika. But mine took longer to come out. The film was, already has been around for a couple of years. We just did a screening recently and we had the filmmaker speak. She is supposed to be here with us. I don't know if she is or not. If she is, I hope she will speak up also. So in a sense, I think, Audrey, to respond to your question, it's a very multimodal methodology, and I really encourage other people to start working like this. Not only does it deal with different materials, it also speaks to very diverse audiences. And I think if we are to survive in academia, we need to be able to do this. We can't any longer speak to a small number of people and to publish something to get a promotion and to stick that thing in the library shelf or in the database. I think public engagement is crucial if we are to try and understand the gravity of the questions that we would like to ask, and engagement in multiple modes. I tried an exhibition, we worked on a film, the film has been out, it's been screened, and there's the book. All of these are aspects of the project, but not one is supplementary to the other, right? That they all work together to create a collective endeavor of trying to explore this question of space and music in Mumbai. So yeah, quickly, Audrey, I'm sorry that took a bit longer than I thought, but this is what I wanted to say about the research process.
Thanks so much, Teju. We will move on to Kwan Ching's question, but before that, I'd just like to remind everybody that you can ask questions directly to Teju or other panelists. You can type Q in the chat room, or you can write down your questions and I'll read out loud. We can move to Kwan Ching's first with his question.
All right. Teju, congratulations. I did read through the entire book. And I was actually one of the very privileged person to go with Teju to see her teacher, right? While the teacher was teaching. It's actually much more complicated than every one of us thinks, because the teaching involved not only the specificity of the song in different historical periods, but also about contemporary life. Right, so a lot of these different things go into the teaching. But one issue, when I read through, keep coming, like lingering in my mind is to cut it short. What is Teju? How do you explain the specificity of this singing classical music? Not only in the I would assume it's not only in the Mumbai context, right, or India at large, or South Asia. Because I'm not aware of this singing classical music, it's taking place everywhere, all right? So I think this may be the issue, what is your hunch, and how do you explain this very phenomena? I think the question is very clear, right? So I think that's the issue.
Okay, thank you so much, Kwan Ching. That's several questions rolled into one. So let me try and figure out how to talk about it. I think let's see. One question is, which a lot of people ask me, especially now that I have been living in Hong Kong, and everyone says, oh, very few people are interested in Chinese music, and it's really difficult for people to learn, whether it's in China or other places that are part of the larger Chinese-speaking cultures. And how is it that in South Asia you have, is it really popular? Is it only a small elite form? And it's always like a surprise. It was a surprise to me in the beginning when I started learning this music to find out how many people were actually learning. I give this random figure in my book, which was told to me by one of my teachers, that at any given moment in Mumbai, there are at least 10,000 people learning this music. I suspect it's actually a larger number. And it's not only Mumbai, although Mumbai is a very important center for this. And without Mumbai, without the gramophone industry, without the radio, without the many facilities that are provided by the new patrons and the rising middle class who wanted to learn this music, to the practitioners who started coming to Mumbai from the late 19th century. Without all of this and without everything that Mumbai has provided, Hindustani music as a whole would not have survived. It's Hindustani music, Andy, is not Hindu music. Hindu refers to a religion, but Hindustani means Hindustan is India. It's another name for India. And so there's North Indian classical music called Hindustani and South Indian classical music that's called Carnatic. Yeah. So we can talk about both Conching, but I'm more qualified to talk about North Indian classical music. And I think partly it is like, yes, it is still very much a living cultural practice. Although interestingly, I find that in the recent past, the audiences, physical audiences are not so large as before, whether it's in Mumbai or Bangalore, because my suspicion is that there are huge audiences online now for this kind of music. So many, many more people and across the world and in the Indian diaspora in particular, and also people who are not Indians, are learning this music, are imbibing this music, are relating to this music in the online, on the online platforms. That is a fairly recent phenomenon. Even the teaching on Skype is about 10 years old or a little older than that. I've been myself learning for 10 years on Skype from different teachers. So I think that there's an interesting way, and this speaks to the reinvention of this music on different platforms. So if this music had been taught in the old way, like you have to live with the teacher, you have to press the feet of the teacher, you do the washing of the teacher, you help with the cooking, and you can get some music. This was how the music was supposed to have been passed on in the old days, by which we mean probably the late 20th century, right? But in the modern pedagogic spaces, how is this passed on? And I think that because the many kinds of spaces have been invented for this over the last century and a little more, that this music has become accessible to so many different people. It doesn't mean that everyone is training to be a practitioner, but everyone is trying to get into the heart of this music, interestingly, right? So this actually addresses directly my problem of musicophilia. I say there's a spectrum of musicophiliacs. There are people who love the music and they just want to listen to it and they will be devoted to it. But in the Mumbai context, and this has to do with the making of that modern public in the non-Western society, right? In the Mumbai context, people was driven so crazy by this music that they had to learn the music themselves. So this, amateur fascination for music that leads to your learning the music. That's why we have so many music schools, so many individual teachers, and it became a livelihood for those teachers who, couldn't live only on performing. So many of them set up music schools, many of them tried to write down the music. So notation systems developed, across the 20th century. And all of this in different ways, while some of the senior musicians say, oh, this is really spoiling the way in which music is taught, but actually it results in more people being taught and more demand for the music, right? So in a sense, I think this, your second question is a very, very big set of questions you asked me. The question is why? Why do you think people are so obsessed with learning this music? And this goes back to something Andy said and something that has come up in the discussion as well. The question of how does one connect to the past? Andy, I would say for me in the Indian context, not about reconnecting to the past, but the past is always with us. It's not that we have lost any connection with it. I think in the Indian context and the context of colonial modernity, which is very different from say Taiwan or China or any other place, in this very specific context, many kinds of things happen. And I talk about some of this in my book. I reference it because other people have written about this. That is that the nationalists in the early part of the 20th century were compelled to invent forms of classical knowledge as opposed to, the Western form. This was, instigated by Western musical theorists themselves. They kept saying, you don't have a classical form. Where is your classical form? Then Indian nationalists and especially people in musicology create this national form, or it's a nationalized form. And in the early days of the 20th century, no one called it Indian classical music. It was simply Indian music. It's especially after independence that I think in India 1947, when we have an all India radio and when we have a radio program devoted to classical music, you call it Indian classical music. So people today very commonly say Shastriya Sangeet or classical music as though it was self-evident. But 50, 60 years ago, it was not self-evident what this music was, right? So it tends to get frozen in some ways because people say this is allowed, this is not allowed, this is classical, this is not classical. But I know that the people who are practitioner friends of mine cross, like in their practice, are able to work across such a wide range of kinds of music that I'm always amazed. And then I see that there are no clear boundaries between these musics, which is why, as Meaghan pointed out, I did say there's folk music, there's film music, there's classical music, and they all are on a spectrum. You can't really separate out the two. So I think it's the interest in melodic forms as a way of connecting to that which is ours that informs this. It's a kind of a proto-nationalism, but it's not only that. In the present, like 60, 70 years after independence, why do we still fantasize about this music, and why do we love it so much? Well, I think it produces the affective milieu in which we live today in the modern world. We are modern Indians, but we learn this music. And it's not about reconnecting to the past, it's about re-signifying the past, I would say.
Thank you, Teju. We have 3 questions lined up for you. So one we have from Pei-Ling. Pei-Ling would like to ask you the question.
Okay.
Pei-Ling, you can unmute yourself.
Hi. So I have a question for Professor Niranjana. Thank you for this panel and everyone, and really excited to read your book. So I'm really interested about what you said about notions of musical selfhood, and I was wondering if you could talk more about that. And I think you mentioned that it's different from the Western kind of bounded idea of self. So what is this kind of musical self? And also how and if they might differ among the hereditaries and the middle class listeners and performers who are learning this.
Sorry, could you repeat your last phrase because you got frozen for a moment?
Oh, sorry. So the different ideas of musical self, how and if they might differ among the hereditary performers and the new middle class learners and performers and listeners. Yeah.
Again, it's a very, very complex question. I don't think I can answer it. I think you should really read my book. But let me just begin or initiate an answer. For the first part, I think what I've argued in the book is that the idea of the self and the idea of the public who's, like a self who's part of that public, takes shape in Indian modernity in the late 19th and early 20th century, just as everyone else is also entering the modern world. But because of the specific migratory histories of Bombay, and because of the fact of it being an imperial city in the British Empire, and because of the transformation of class divisions, of the formation of new classes, the formation of new tastes, the formation of new forms of entertainment, because of many, many multiple reasons which I document very thoroughly in my book. And it's not just my attempt to document it, it's something I reference many, many other wonderful writers who've talked about this, because I'm trying to provide the framework within which you can understand them. I'm not producing the new material. Anyway, so what I've tried to do in the book is taking the instance of Mumbai to talk about how the self is formed. So in a sense, the new form that Hindustani music takes in the 20th century is a form of the khayal. If you listen to any Hindustani music, you'll understand what the khayal means. It's a composition-based thing, but it's completely improvised. Khayal also means imagination or flight of fancy, yeah? And in a sense, increasingly in the 20th century, people, musical practitioners, music lovers, began to emphasize the interiority of musical experience that is then expressed when the musician sings, right? So if you look at this interiority question, you'll obviously, if you're familiar with, say English or German or French romantic literature, you'll begin to think of the interiority of, that person who's the hero of romantic literature, right? But I would like to say that it's not that romantic agential subject we're talking about in the non-Western context, but here we're really talking about a different kind of subject who's achieves their subjectivity in sociality. And this is why I think of this musical self as not a bounded individual, but as someone who becomes a self in this larger social space, the space of collective listening in this instance. Yeah. So that really addresses the first part of what you're saying. The second part is too complex. If you would like to read my book and then send me a question, I'm happy to respond to it. This book launch is also about getting you to buy the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Teju. We have a next question from Supraja. Supraja, you can unmute yourself.
Hello, Professor Niranjana. Absolutely wonderful to have read your work and follow it all through the years. So I'm a performance scholar, currently studying in JNU, and the way that we've actually started to grapple with your work has been in regard to looking at migration and performance. And that's how we met with the first book that you had that you spoke of, which was on Trinidad. And the one right now, I find that the conceptualization of interiority and exteriority that you have, particularly with grappling with heterotopias in the Indian metropolis, it does quite a great deal to look at this sense of provocation of what does trans or queer feminism within a framework of performance in India exactly. What does it do when we look at collapsing the structure of classical, traditional, the folk? When we look at cultural labor, because you spoke of the Devadasi, you spoke of the Jog. I mean, and in that extension, you look at the Jogati as well. You look at certain performing practices that were that were excluded from the caste system, but then also given this sense of elevation that they're separate from this, right? So the contention of this within the theater of roots framework, you see how migration has also happened towards, obviously, the urban cities, the urban capitals of various states. And so you see forms such as Yakshagana or even Nautanki and Chow have morphed into something else, have morphed into something that is not exactly what it was in the coastal spaces or within the non-urban setting. And to someone like me who is steeped in the urban, who is from Bangalore, whose interaction or first interface with Yakshagana was through, say, Charanya Ramprakash's performance of Akshambara, how exactly would you extend or would you look at extending this concept of musicophilia then into this of folk and performance?
I am not sure I entirely follow the question, but I think it's something you're thinking through yourself, because you first moved to an engagement with my work, which you seem to know reasonably well, and referencing a number of cultural practices that will be totally unfamiliar to most of the people in this audience. It's obviously, you need to be quite steeped in a certain set of cultures of performance in the Indian context. There are people here in the room struggling to even understand what is Indian music or classical music. So I think it may be too much to get them to grapple with all the many forms that you have touched upon. Also, I don't feel I'm competent to answer the question in the way that you have posed it to me, because I'm not thinking about these forms. I mean, at least not right now. Yeah. I mean, I just finished writing this book. Please give me some time to recover from my labors of the last 10 years. And this is not a direction I'm going in, because I do things as they come to me. And these have not come to me as things I should be engaging with at this moment. Yeah. So I'm not, a scholar who says, okay, there are 10 things and there are five kinds of performance, and I'll first write a book about this and then about this and then about this. No, I just go where the wind takes me. So in a sense, I've watched most of the forms that you mentioned. I watch a lot of stuff online these days, but I haven't felt the need, or maybe the questions that I want to ask, which are not always only about the form itself, have not come to me when I'm watching these. So maybe that's why I haven't yet grappled with any of that. So, but thanks for bringing it up, and I will, relook at these in a different light.
Thank you, Teju. We have a last question from Satish. Satish would like me to read the question. Speaking about public engagement and multimodal methodologies, what do you think of Indian music collectives and fusion groups that have made classical music more accessible and enjoyable, and in the process have created new fans in the present generation?
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question, but it sort of relates back to what I said in response to Quanxing's question, that I'm not sure that the kinds of new music that are being produced, and there's some very wonderful things coming out, which I do follow, I'm not sure they are simply finding a new audience for Indian classical music. I think they're creating new music. So while the melodic structures of Indian music, the so-called classical music, may find their way into these new kinds of fusion, it's not that the listeners are actually accessing those other, the so-called Indian classical music, which are still available in those forms, right? So I think it does, maybe it enlarges the audience for music, I don't know. But these are different kinds of music that are coming out today. And there's some amazing bands, even in my hometown of Bangalore, that are drawing on different kinds of melodic structures to be able to produce new forms, and in different languages, including in English. So I'm not sure that it actually enlarges the classical music audience, but I think it does indeed bring in new people to the appreciation of music.
Thank you so much, Teju. I'm sure everyone who have asked their question really appreciate your your answers. I think we have to move on because of time to end the book launch. We'll move on to Audrey now.
Okay, thanks, Teju, and thanks to all our speakers and to everyone who's asked questions. If people still have questions to ask Teju, please do email her with your comments and questions. But we've now come to the end of our webinar. I'd like to congratulate Teju on a wonderful book. I read it in one setting, and I read it from back to back. I still can't see because of the background, sort of my background slide. But anyway, it's an essential book in any cultural studies curriculum going forward. So I encourage all of you to grab hold of it. So I want to congratulate Teju on her book, and to thank her and our distinguished speakers for an inspiring session. There are many takeaways from the book, as we've heard in the last 1.5 hours. For myself, in particular, a deep, rich cultural history of Hindustani art music, and it's sort of seeping into its material urban cultures. So reading the pages and invoking Meaghan's act of reading, I can feel myself with Teju, alongside Teju, along the laneways and alleyways in Mumbai as well. So the kind of texture of the urban material space and the sonic affect are extremely rich in the book. So that's one, sort of deep cultural history of Hindustani art music. And secondly, how the shared music, how the language of shared music functions as a site for diverse migrant groups to come together to form a new metropolitan unconscious through which new pedagogies, subjectivities, and urban socialities are produced, and a new vocabulary to locate Indian or Mumbai modernity constructed through the exhibition, display, and performance of music. So this, I think Kim Soyoung in her talk brought out this term that's in the book, Pradashan modernity, a new kind of modernity constituted in and through the display, spectacle, and performance of music. And finally, of course, through all that, the emergence of the musical subject as a social subject, and not in the Euro-American sense as an individual subject. So all of these together make up what I would say the key features of the Inter-Asia Cultural Studies project. So please share the book widely. Please ask your library to buy more copies of the book, and please include it in your teaching and your research. So we will be, the Inter-Asia Cultural Studies Society will be hosting more webinars in the next few months, including the launch of a new cultural research center at Lingnan University in Hong Kong in September, and a cultural studies in Singapore webinar in November. So please look out for our announcements. And if you've got other events that you want to let the Inter-Asia group know, please also do email us as well. So in the meantime, like I said, if you want to contact us, please scan the details from our slide, and then you can have our details. So on the behalf of the Inter-Asia Cultural Studies Society, the Inter-Asia Cultural Studies Movements Journal, and the National University of Singapore Cultural Research Center, thank you for coming to our webinar. So please stay safe and keep well.